Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming, and I'd like to introduce you and welcome Ian Abley back to the university. Ian has made several visits over the years, and we were just remembering one particular event that Ian organised years ago where there was a map in here, 1 to 50,000 of the whole of England, and that's when Ian was planning 250 new towns. Anyway, he's still working on it. So, yeah.
Drawing club at the building centre.
Yeah. Anyway, it's really nice to get Ian back. Ian is also working with Wilfred at the moment, who runs the Part 3 course. And throughout the Grenfell inquiry, Ian has kept this fantastic, there's been this kind of running commentary. And I think Ian's just quite keen that people are telling the truth. In some cases, maybe they weren't. And which is an amazing sort of record. And if you want to read about we're very close to Grenfell here. 72 people died, and there's an amazing book called Show Me the Bodies by Peter Apps. And Ian is one of the few people that is name-checked in there to say thanks for keeping a lookout for these things in terms of construction, but also kind of technical design. So Ian's got some models, which we'll talk about later. But anyway, so nice to have you back. So thank you, Ian. I'll leave you there.
Thanks, Will. Thank you. This talk is, and you forgive me, I'm 61. I started training in 1980. I've spent most of my life on building sites, except for the last couple of years working for insurers at the Fire Protection Association. So some of this is a bit mixed up, but hopefully I'm going to run the theme of scrutiny. That's not working. Sorry, well, that's not moving on.
Sometimes it just freezes. No, that's all right. Sometimes it just freezes. No? Maybe it is that one.
Right. Oh, yeah.
Nope.
It's got a thing on there. What's that knife?
PC1.
It worked before, didn't it? Sorry about this.
Oh, there we go. There you go.
Great, thank you.
That's okay. So it's those dots. I'll move that.
Yeah, great. Thanks. The poster is introducing the theme of the whole talk, I hope. What nobody wants is a building that is as useless as a chocolate teapot. The developers, nobody, the users, nobody needs a useless building. And I think that if Grenfell taught anybody anything, if all of the other things that have happened in the past that have gone wrong, or going back to any of the fires or any of the disasters you want to talk about, even Summerland, which was the disaster that I remember when I was training in 1980, that occurred in 1972. Nobody wants a chocolate teapot building unless you're going to make a milkshake. You want a chocolate teapot. What you actually want is a strategy. I've got to use that. Okay.
Yeah,
sorry. Thanks. Got to find a strategy for producing your building, and you're producing the building. You're part of the production. So that the thing that's become apparent, particularly in the last 6.5 years, is that the law is pretty loose when it comes to building control. It's really tight on planning, but oddly, it's incredibly loose on what the building regulations require. And the law is all about being reasonable. So health and life safety is not an absolute. there's an expectation in Britain that there is going to be injury and there is going to be death. It's just a question of what's unreasonable. And that's what unreasonable looks like, and that's the Turkey earthquake and 56,000 dead, because building regulations in a seismic zone were very loose. As a matter of policy, the Turkish government had allowed an amnesty on a lot of basic engineering. That's an egregious example. That's not what's happened in Britain. The worst case recently is 72 dead, as Will said, at Grenfell. But a lot of companies are having to think about how they deliver on a useful building. What is a useful building? What is a building that is serving the public and not just being engineered down to being reasonably life-safe, reasonably healthy? So the company I'm currently doing some work for, I've just done something very simple, which is take the RIBA plan of work and think about how over the course of a project, and I'm taking that everybody in this room knows what the RIBA plan of work is. If not, look it up, because it's just a useful temporal tool for thinking about how a project is put together. But the strategy starts with the money. The strategy always starts with the money. It starts with the capital at the front end. The law gives you just a decision matrix. And you don't need much more than this to start thinking about being a young architect, being an architect running a job. The thing you need is a bit of a critical appraisal of what the decisions are you're being expected to make. So as the project moves forwards and as the legal decisions that you're making become very real in pursuit of reasonable health and life safety for most things other than thermal insulation, which has a different policy push. I'll come back to that. These things occupy you, but they're not the stuff that's not the stuff that makes you want to get up in the morning and be an architect. All of the legislation and all of the talk of regulations is somehow killing, I think, the creative process. You've got to find a way creatively through the things you are expected to do, but you've got to be critical. That's part of the creative process is having a critical mind. At the moment, we've got the response to Grenfell has been to say, oh, well, we didn't mean that. We didn't mean, the government is retreating from its own responsibility for getting things right, for making sure that the regulations are correct. So that one of the major retreats has been to exclude from the guidance that everybody was following a whole set of building categories. So the statutory guidance, the approved documents, don't cover things like awkward ground, something that's complicated, very big or very tall, timber, anything to do with timber, or buildings that are modern methods of construction. That's everything. I mean, every piece of construction is modern by definition because you're doing it now. It's not like you're in a heritage world of hand-adzed timber. Everything is modern. But the state is retreating from its responsibility to explain what you need to do to satisfy the law. You've got to be very critical as a designer. So with Wilfred, with the Part 3 course, one of the places to start thinking critically is escape. Escape is one of the fundamental parts of designing a building. First, you make sure it doesn't collapse. That's A. And B is make sure that everybody can get out. Now, according to the law, not everybody has to get out. You have to make reasonable provision for health and life safety. I'm yet to see a politician that will say 5 dead is okay. So there's a conflict in the law that allows legal wriggle room that you've made enough provision for escape with the expectation that everybody is going to get out. So part of the Part 3 course has been to think about escape, think about travel distances, and you can have these slides later, so forgive me if I'm going too fast. Think about flats. how flats are laid out. That guidance is provided to you, and then immediately the state is taking that guidance away because you're not allowed to apply these rules necessarily to complicated tall, timber, any other modern building. So the guidance exists, and yet it doesn't exist. We're in a strange moment, and I'll come back to that as well. I think it's going to get easier next year for a very simple reason. And not every building is flat. So the purpose groups that exist in the regulations are something that's worth getting to know, something that's worth thinking about at college, whether it's the residential dwellings, other kind of nurses' homes, other kind of residential, and it runs through offices, shops, commercial and retail, assembly and recreation, industrial, and then storage at the end. Those things are very broad, and whilst the guidance sounds authoritative, once you start thinking about what that actually means, which kind of a school, junior schools, senior schools, those things should be exercising you as a designer. You need to be critical of seemingly simple guidance, I think, in a way that makes the complexity simple again. You've got to get back to simplicity. So part of the current conversation, and you can see it embedded in this table, if you can only escape one way, you get one set of travel distances, which we're measuring in the Part 3 course. We're testing those out as part of a blindfold exercise. If you've got two directions, you've got a much bigger number. That's the two stairs discussion that the RIBA is having for the last 6 years. Why isn't anybody talking about the lifts? Why isn't anybody suggesting that in an emergency, you don't need two stairs, you need a lift? I mean, that would be something that meant you didn't have to drag a disabled person down the stairs. If you've got kids, you can use the lift. Where's the criticism of the rhetorical flourish that the RIBA has been pushing since Grenfell, that two stairs good, one stair bad? Why not think about the kind of escape that you need? That level of thinking isn't happening. Again, I think it's going to change next year, and I'll come back to why. So what we were doing at the insurers, and it does get a bit more pictorial in a minute, was to think about, beyond health and life safety, what would the insurers require? So we worked up a set of essential principles, which I've given us a lecture before as an A to Z, for the insurers to go beyond health and life safety, because in the guidance, that's all you get for property protection. So if you're talking about a chocolate teapot building, the law reasonably expects you to get everybody out. Doesn't quite quantify how many people can be injured and killed. What's reasonable? It's not absolute. And it also allows every building to burn to the ground. Now, if you told your client that at day one as a strategy, that their building was going to collapse, and that was legal, they'd probably sack you as an architect. If you don't have that conversation with your client at the beginning, they'll probably sack you as the architect, because you need to articulate what's the strategy for keeping the property. The old ways of doing that are quite boring. Sprinklers was a technique for suppressing the growth of the fire, so that you had a fighting chance as the fire brigade to come in and put out a small fire rather than let the fire get bigger. This guidance was needed to be updated, which is what we've been doing for the last couple of years, reconciling the old sprinkler rules with compartmentation requirements for the different purpose groups. But in doing that, we realised something else amongst the insurers, that we needed to think about how sprinklers and fire suppression and the way the compartment in different purpose groups kept the fire into a small space. We needed to get a simple set of rules that ended up being the core of a larger document. That was the working model. So we had a Scotch egg model for this document. It worked quite well, really. And that's available now. So you don't look at this as if it's a novel. It's utterly boring, but it's 300 items arranged alphabetically that are a good way of thinking about what you might need to do in your building. It could be a critique of your building. And the first question is, do you really want your building to burn down? Are you quite willing to tell your client that they're going to lose their entire building? In a Travelodge up in Scotland, a modular Travelodge, that's exactly what happened. Everybody got out and the building burnt down. Everyone was happy, the building was insured, the insurers paid out, and nobody was injured. A success. If that was a hospital, and you've got several operating theatres where people have literally opened up in the operating theatre and have got a 4-hour operation, you want that hospital to be able to sustain a fire in its compartmentation, and for wherever the fire is in the other wards or in the corridors, you want that hospital to withstand a number of hours of uninterrupted service. Those are the kinds of decisions that you need to have to discuss with your client. If you're building the Shard, fundamentally different to building a house. So as architects, as you become more successful and you get bigger and better clients and your buildings become more complex, and the government in Britain tells you that you can't rely on their guidance because you're just designing a complicated building, you're on your own. You're having to think critically about what you should be doing. There isn't a set of rules. There's a set of thoughts. That's different. And you can articulate those thoughts. That's what the insurer's guidance breaks down to, against the RIBA plan of work. And you can tabulate it. And already it's utterly boring. It's a boring process of scheduling, thinking, ordering your work. And I've deliberately made the front end of this talk boring because a lot of the job is boring. I mean, there's nothing more boring than Part Z. That's where it's heading. Everybody's counting carbon molecules. That's where the approved documents are going. So every decision, the whole burden of creative thought is now being filtered through whether or not you've reduced your carbon so that your tiny building is going to make a contribution to saving the planet's climate. That's apart from being utterly tedious, that's a massive burden on every decision you make as a designer. There's got to be a more creative way of acting than that. So at one level, the approved documents are becoming like accountancy. You're having to design like an accountant. And at the next minute, the government's telling you that they're not taking any responsibility for any of the advice they've given you. It's an unreasonable set of circumstances I think people are being asked to work under. And it never used to be like that. I think that the push to an over burden of responsibility put on the designer has come from the end of the Cold War. And the thing that ran into the end of the Cold War was a turn to environmentalism. That's the Brundtland definition. Where you're expected as a designer, and every little thing you do, the choice of flooring, whether or not you're using a particular kind of a wall, whether you choose to use a modular building, which we'll come to in a minute, you're almost expected to be clairvoyant. Not having reasonable foresight, your ability to save the planet is increasingly becoming the duty you're expected to have as an architect. That seems intolerable to me. It's asking too much of something that's mostly a practical task, like arguing for an escape lift, like having the conversation with the planners who want to make your building out of timber that maybe they've got a problem if you make a timber hospital. But it'd be sustainable. But is it any longer a hospital? Has it suddenly become a chocolate teapot? And since 1987, it's all been codified in increasing numbers of of categories and targets and things that you're being forced to think about, even before you put mouse to computer or pen to paper, as it used to be. Creatively, I think that must be stifling. But if a client is only concerned with hitting these targets, something is going to get lost. And I don't just mean health and safety of people. I mean architecture. The thing that's being forgotten is the whole point of being an architect in the first place. So, early on, my advice is to get very critical with your client, to interrogate the brief, interrogate the strategy, turn briefs down, but mostly be a critical person from the very beginning, because that's how you're going to serve the job, how you're going to serve the client, and how ethically you're increasingly expected to serve society or the planet as a client. In here, there's a part in this that puts is arguing that the planet should be a legal entity, and you're meant to serve that as a designer. That seems almost insane to me. So once you've worked out your strategy, you're going to get into some detail, and you've got to understand what the choices you've made. If you've chosen timber, if you've chosen modular, if you've chosen MMC, or any of the things that the state is now saying are not covered by the approved documents, you're on your own, Mr. Architect. You might employ a fire engineer, but they're going to soon turn around and say, well, we need some fire testing. Or before Grenfell, the emphasis was on weather testing. So you'd probably phone up the Centre for Window and Cladding Technology, and you design a beautiful facade and have it tested to make sure it didn't leak. Fire, more so now, since Grenfell. Should have happened before, but the idea of testing in advance, testing before you get to planning, because the other way of thinking about it, once you start to get to planning, and the planning decision means that your developer's land has turned into a huge asset, because you've won them planning approval. What your client, the money behind you is going to need to know is that you've done well in the market for them, that they are not going to end up with a building that is a lemon in the market, but a peach. Not my idea. Akerlof from 1970s, is a Nobel Prize-winning economist. Recently wrote Animal Spirits after the financial crash. You don't want a lemon of a building. And if you want to find the lemon of a building definition, and you've got a week to find it, you could listen to Paul Hyatt, who was the president of the RIBA around 2001, 2002. Just listen to what he says in day 63, 64, and 65 of the Grenfell Tower inquiry. He dissects very carefully the decisions that the architects made at Grenfell, and does a very good job as an expert witness, because what he doesn't indulge is hindsight. He's very clear to articulate that. He's critical, massively critical. He's critical of a lot more people than the architect. But he's understood that when things go wrong, when you get a lemon and people get injured or killed, everybody is coming back to look at your decisions. Now that's a real responsibility. That's not an estranged responsibility to save the planet. That's a real responsibility to be an architect that can account for themselves and has understood the strategic decisions they've made, can actually show that they were critical from the beginning. Watch that. If you want a digest, email me, because Global has produced a digest. Paul Hyatt was one of the expert witnesses amongst a number. And what he said, and this is something that I'm going to go into a great deal of detail on the Part 4 course, what Paul Hyatt said in the inquiry is that there was a clear distinction between the thermal insulation that went into Grenfell and the cladding. The cladding, which is that, aluminium composite material. At the technical innovation, how do you roll 1,500 millimetre wide, 1.5 metre wide aluminium coil, 0.5 millimetre thick, into a plastic sheet that's flat, perfectly flat, any colour you want, relatively cheap and easy to cut? That's a technical innovation. The trouble was it could get through the test that the government had set up for what was called Class 0. No, I've spent my entire life up until 14th of June 2017 specifying Class 0, insisting that it was bought on site, testing it, make sure it was tested, and insisting it had certificates. On the 15th of June, I'd have been a crook, or at least negligent, if I was then specifying Class 0, without thinking about how did that cladding get to be on not just that building, but as we now know, many, not just high-rise, but low-rise buildings that the government won't try and rectify. It's only interested in rectifying the high-rise. It's made a policy decision that people in low-rise buildings can take their chances with that kind of cladding. And there's a simple answer, which Paul Hyatt understood. And Paul Hyatt understood that in his day 63, 64, 65, because he'd been given the report that Barbara Lane, the fire engineer, gave on day 68 in advance. He made a distinction that the architects had got the insulation wrong, but the cladding, different problem, Paul Hyatt says, quite rightly, because the architects had relied on certificates that said it was Class 0. And it may not have actually had all the tests for Class 0 for every colour, but that product was on the market as Class 0. The reason being, and this is a bit of a spoiler for the Part 3 course, is that that's a water-cooled frame in the test equipment, because the test equipment was developed in 1987 to improve on the stuff that had come from the 1970s, where they used to nail the sample onto or hold it onto a door that gets swung round in front of a big radiant heater. The water-cooled frame was to allow them to test plastics, and it worked, because the sample of this going into the water-cooled frame didn't melt around the edges, so it could get through the test. The little oven was the Part 6 part of the test, had an exclusion clause. So only if the observer had spotted anything melting out the back did you fail. So if the observer went to the toilet, was a bit blind, chose not to see, or it didn't happen on a particular day, it happened 100 times before, it didn't happen that day, you could get that material through the test. And in 1997, they did get it through the test. It got a Class 0 certificate. That's what the tester would see. The big sample in the water-cooled frame is obviously melted. But that's not a failure criteria in the test. Now, the only people who would know that, the only people who could be critical of that, are people who've seen testing. So I think one of the lessons of Grenfell is, as architects, ask to see tests, because you'll learn a hell of a lot by wanting to go and see a fire door test, wanting to see the weather tightness test, any kind of testing. If you're specifying testing, be critical of the tests you're specifying, because you might find that those tests are useless. Those tests are a chocolate teapot. You've got to be critical of what you're asking for. And you don't want to wait until Debbie Smith waited. She waited 20 years, actually, 20 years, to sit in testimony in front of a QC and have the epiphany, as somebody who ran tests all her life, that the British Standard test was like comparing an apple with an orange. That's a career-breaking epiphany. They're the kinds of things that you don't want to have, because you want to spend your life being a critic. You want to be critical. You want to be thinking what could go wrong, and you want to be constructive, because you're a designer and you're an architect and you're creative. So the critical nature of being an architect isn't at odds with the creative process. And your investors should thank you. If they sack you for being critical, you've got the wrong investor. You've got the wrong... If you're asking too many awkward questions and the contractor tells you to shut up, or somebody tells you to leave the job, you've done a good job. They've got rid of you for a reason. Now, this is where I'll use the models as an illustration. Grenfell was the requirement B41. The law says something very vague but obvious, sensible, even though it's couched in terms of reasonable. But the law says something very obvious about cavities in modular buildings. Remembering that modular buildings are excluded from the approved document because they're modern methods of construction. They're tall if you're stacking them up, but they're very much being demanded by government. They're being funded by government with huge subsidies. But has everybody been critical enough about modular? I'm going to argue that no, and this is one of the things that we're exercising the insurers. This model builds up in quarters into that problem. So as the idea being that you start to see the modules coming together, and it's quite difficult when you start drawing modules. You're drawing boxes, and it'd be easy on the computer to imagine there's not a problem. You start to think about how full of holes these things are if they're made out of steel and light gauge stud work and plasterboard, a lot of plasterboard. They've got bases. The base of the box and the way those bases fit together start to create cavities all the way through. And if you stack the next box up on top, you've got a vertical and a horizontal cavity, not running up the outside of your building, but running right the way through the middle. That needs to be fire stopped. And the only moment you can do that is when you've stacked these things up. So that as you're on the crane and the next unit is coming in, somebody has got to be up on that roof putting something between these boxes, like mineral fibre, so fire-resisting insulation, fire stopping. That's got to be somehow positioned to close off these cavities. Whether that's done or not is down to you. Whether or not you've been the architect that's insisted your modular tower is not just a series of cavities, but a series of compartments, is completely down to you. The system you've chosen, you can't just leave it to the system provider to, don't worry, we're experts, trust us. You've got to prove that you can get that junction built. And the only way you're going to do that is by being critical. Now, you don't need to, that's not new knowledge. It's been known for 20 odd years that this is required. There's even very good whistleblowing guidance on this. So the cross reports, it's quite a good service really. The structural engineers are a lot more sophisticated at being critical, self-critical, than I think architects are. Since the 1970s, the structural engineers have anonymously sent in to a department in the Institute of Structural Engineers and the Institute of Civil Engineers problems they find on site and share the problems. They anonymise it so that people don't get the sack. It's a very good service. After Grenfell, the people who established that service for decades brought in the Institute of Fire Engineers. And since Grenfell, there's been a lot of very good cross reports. They're worth looking at. The strange thing is that architects are nowhere. There's nothing in coming from the RIBA. There's nothing. If you were working on a job and you'd gone to your boss and you said, I think we've got a problem, he goes, shut up. We haven't. Don't rock the boat. There's nowhere for you to go as a critical architect. There's nowhere for you to find out that actually several other people on different jobs. You might maybe do that socially if you're lucky, You might suddenly find that there's common ground with other people. But if you're critical, there isn't a place for the RIBA to let you to be critical. Now, and I find that actually quite telling, that in this new practice guide that you're all expected to comply with, which asks you to be saints, basically, nowhere is there something practical like a facility that would anonymise tip-offs and warnings and publish those, so that the chocolate teapot problem was starting to be addressed. That seems to be a lack of self-criticism by the institution, in my mind, leaving people exposed to the sack. That doesn't get easier with inspection necessarily. Inspection is often making sure that you've got good materials and workmanship. Being critical of if the bricks turn up and they look wrong, you send them away. If the installation is not in line, is out of tolerance, you condemn it. That's part of an architect's job. Very unpopular part of an architect's job, but a necessary one. Inspections, an old role, really. The Institute of Clerk of Works, Clerk of Works go back longer before than they had an institute. It was often an older person who'd come up through the tools and was given the job of making sure that the materials and work on site were good. Now, these days, and I think what Global are interested in doing is taking that inspection process back down the time of a project back towards the client, so that you can start to think about testing and think about inspection earlier in the job. These days, you might be called a resident engineer or a resident architect, and you're part of a far bigger division of labour than clerks of works would have been in traditional masonry construction. It gets complicated. And part of the being critical is not to dampen down the creative efforts of someone like Herzog de Meuron on the Tate Modern. You're not there to be a problem, you're there to stop something going wrong. You may have been involved, as I was, in the early days of the Tate Modern, thinking about how on earth did you put that thing together. I then left the Ramble at the time, came back several years later, because they'd gone through the process of prototyping the façade. They knew what they wanted to do. It wasn't the guess I had years earlier. They did a completely different thing. But they had the job of assembling this building with a contractor who had 1,100 panels. And they had to be put together. And yet, how did you know that they'd all been assembled in the right way? So I spent 13 months on site at the Tate Modern as a discrete job. It wasn't going to be a career. It was just that once it was finished, it was finished. And I had to think about how as one person can I get round this entire building and make sure that that's been put together. It was almost like an impossible task. I had to check all the joints, make sure the joints didn't leak either. Because somebody was asking me to say, is it all right? Can we move on? Can we put the next phase of the work on? The joints had been tested for weather tightness. And I had a cold a couple of months into the task, and it just, probably because my brain was a bit overheated, it just dawned on me, I just need to go back to something old-fashioned. So I made a cardboard information model, which is just the elevations. Took it in on the bus to Tate Modern, and got laughed at hugely by Mace initially, and then they just thought I was an idiot, and then started colouring it in. Every time, so I got four brackets to check on every panel and all the joints and various other parts of the inspection process. Every time you found something, I could record it. Now, what the project managers wanted me to do was to send that into an electronic document management system, which would generate a telephone number that I couldn't remember. So I did it this way, and then photographed the model, and then put that into the electronic document management system. But this way, we had a graphical demonstration of how the building was put together, where the leaks were as we found them, what you could do about them, until the whole job got to the end, and my immediate line manager, Kai Richter, could breathe a sigh of relief because he knew that we got to the end of 1,100 panels and everything was fine. Now, it wasn't easy. There was a lot of criticism along the way, lots of shouting at, being shouted at by contractors, even being banned off the scaffold. But you had to kind of hold a line. You had to be critical and had to insist on the proof of the job so that you could get to the moment where you could put your hand on your heart and say, this isn't a chocolate teapot. This building has been put together right. Or even identify the 5 areas, rather than the 50 areas, hopefully the 5 areas, where you need further works. Get to that stage, you've got a handover. You're probably out of a job then if you're on a contract, but that you've done your job. And it ends up looking like it was meant to look, and now it's fantastic building. And I love, well, before they shut the viewing gallery down, I used to like going for a cup of coffee. It took me about 6 months to forget everything that had happened before I could go in and enjoy a cup of coffee and watch the public. And I can't wait for it to reopen again. But that critical role, you were a pain in the arse. You were a Billy No-Mates on the site. What Global are trying to do is to get over the idea that criticism, inspection, testing, those things are an obstacle to success. They're actually the route to success. And I think one of the big effects of Grenfell, it's a painful way of learning this lesson, 72 dead, has been that people are starting to understand the value of checking, the value of criticism even. And architects have been trained to critique. We're in a good position to critique. We're in a market that's complicated. The construction products all the time, a cornucopia of construction products. So I've got to know somehow what's the difference between these 3 kinds of fluff. As from Rockwool, brilliant fluff. It's fire resisting and it's made out of basalt rock and it's made like candy floss. But these, even within that material, there are 3 different characteristics at least. Being an architect's not easy. You're in the market, you've got a cornucopia of things that you could build out of. What's the good one? What's the bad one? What's the peach, the good one, and what's the lemons? Not a new problem at all. These days you've got to do it digitally. These days you'd be shipping things in from around the planet. An instance in the past had been the Spanish slate problem, where it ended up having to know which quarry in Spain was shipping dodgy slate so that you didn't get caught out. People got caught out for huge sums of money over procurement deals that had gone wrong. That's just the ordinary kind of going wrong. The egregious case of the test being wrong for something like cladding, that's brand new. That's history making, which is why we're about to see construction history being made. And so this, Paul Hyatt says the architects were perfectly legitimate in relying on the British Board of Agreement certificate that said that cladding was good to go on the building. That basically discredits the certification company, potentially. Or does that mean that every British Board of Agreement certificate post-Grenfell is now in doubt? Some people reacted like that. A lot. The director of the BBA has had to work, the one that took over the job after Grenfell, he's had to work very hard to recover the trust and the belief in the agreement certificate. So third-party accreditation has taken a kicking by bitter experience. That was just Grenfell. Imagine the third-party certification of a modular system. If there's an injury or a fatality in a fire involving a modular building next, the entire modular sector is going to pay the price. Now, that's not supposed to happen. What's the United Kingdom Accreditation Service is meant to be overseeing the third-party accreditors, the people who issue certificates. confidence has been lost in that system by government. Now, instead of the Communities Ministry being responsible for materials, business has stepped in and set up the Office for Product Safety and Standards. Nobody knows how this is going to work. Nobody's prosecuted anybody yet. This is brand new territory. Hopefully, they're going to be very critical. There are all sorts of things on the market that the OPSS could take off the market, should take off the market as unsafe. And they should start with the basic problem, which is the old national standards. There's 15 of them. The number 10, the guide to how you use them, is just a guide to their application. But there's a huge row right now that was a subject of consultation between December and March this year that says, why on earth did the British government keep a parallel set of outdated, inferior British standards that undermined the European? You don't have to, whatever your position on Brexit doesn't matter. The technical point is that since 2000, the British standards were sustained for some reason. Now that's why were those standards sustained when there's a parallel and weaker system? Who knew? I'll come back to that in a minute. If you go to Europe, they've got a very disciplined, structured approach that you test the direct field of application and then you can interpolate or extrapolate from those tests. They don't let you desktop study. That's a good thing. You can make technical assessments by experts and through people who, if you're trying to technically assess a set of fire doors and it's been put in a different way, you can get an expert in that kind of installation to give you a technical assessment. That's different to a desktop study. But for years, most of this century, there was a promiscuity in Britain about desktop studies, uncritical use of desktop studies. The lack of criticism. People, to a point where the whole thing got so surreal that people claiming to be looking at a substitution or a variation from a test, nobody was checking who they were or what they knew, or you just took desktop studies and you were meant to accept them. You got shouted down if you didn't accept them. Not now, not since 72 dead, high price to pay for a bit of rigour. Now, most people won't accept desktop studies, and good. But there's pushback, even 6 years post-Grenfell. I think by the spring, that pushback will be over. That report's worth reading, because that actually articulates the problem with testing, inspection, certification. She's a KC, Annalise Day. But it falls short, and it pulls its punches and is inadequate because this man hasn't spoken. This man's going to be the most critical person you'll never want to meet as an architect. He's Martin Morbick. He's been running the inquiry for the last 6 years, and one of two things is going to happen. Either Martin Morbick pulls all his punches and doesn't follow through on the evidence that's come out of the inquiry, or, like Paul Hyatt, is precisely critical of the process that's been at work in British construction, and everything is going to change next spring. There'll be a demand for rigour, for criticism, for testing, inspection and certification based on a strategy, some purpose. Because you can't get to compliance without having that purpose. I mean, what are you complying with? Unless you know just reasonable health and life safety. It's okay if a couple of people get injured and killed. It's okay if my building burns down. Is it really? What are you complying with? And this is already the success story, I think, because lots of people have developed techniques, measuring techniques, air tightness tests, acoustic tests for showing compliance. They are critical of finished buildings. That's the last week of a job is the last moment you want to be critical of your building. Find out that it's not been put together right. People are starting to monetize the idea of taking that compliance path back to the client at the beginning. So you end up with a memorable process, a mental rigor that you can talk to the client and from the very beginning and work all the way through the job, a complicated division of labour, and get to the end. So you don't end up with a chocolate teapot, and you get a happy client. I've got a thing about Scotch eggs, sorry. It seemed a waste, cutting one in half. Because the thing you don't want, you want compliance. Compliance with something stronger than the law. Compliance with an architecture, compliance with a brief, compliance with something that's better than the law, really. You don't want to be cowed by the law. You need to have really thought through what you're doing with your hospital, what you're doing with your play theatre, what you're doing with your car park. Really get inside your building, understand your building, and make it better than the legal requirements that people might want to value engineer you down to. Not all clients, a lot of clients are expecting very good things. Enforcement's bad enough. This guidance now, and this trilogy of new requirements that architects are meant to face, misses, I think, one basic thing, that it's every kind of ethical principle you could possibly imagine, and no doubt the second edition will be even bigger. All of these documents will become larger and larger in the next 5 years, and it seems like the burden of more esoteric stuff that's outside of the job is going to be put on your shoulders as designers. What they don't answer is how would you have tested competency on the 13th of June 2017 compared to the 15th of June 2017? Because if I would have been incompetent if I'd specified anything other than class 0 on the 13th of June up to then, and on the 15th of June going forwards, that would be utterly stupid and I should be struck off. What these guides don't do, they seem to eternalise the problem in general unpoliceable ways. That Dieter Bentley Gottman's one is a bit more precise. But we're straying into a burden of ethics and a burden of duty to people who are not your client and people you're never going to meet because they're not even born yet. And there's a temporal shift in a lot of these duties that doesn't actually get to the task of how you put together a modular tower so that it's safe. It doesn't get to the practical task of building architecture. Now, these people are well-meaning. They've got the ear of the RIBA, and this is the direction of travel. And Caris Rowlands is a barrister. They're changing the profession. They're changing the profession that's in Little Britain, in looking at the world. So already the scope of your action is constrained by the tiny little job you're on, when you're meant to be looking at the detail, you're meant to be critical. And the law won't care. That's the other thing. The ethics book holds up all sorts of examples of where the law is going to step in and force people to take responsibility. That's not how it works. The inquiry is how it works. The Grenfell Tower inquiry. Something goes badly wrong, and then armies of people tear you to shreds. That's not a position you ever want to be in. You want to avoid that predicament from the start. The law won't help you with that. The law will just weigh you up and then punish you with the sword. And it'll do it impartially at the best of times. And it'll point to things like this. It'll say, well, why did you make those decisions, Mr. Ian Abley, architect, as I used to be? I've deregistered now. I've spent too long on site. Why did you not have reasonable in mind? Why weren't you critical enough? Why didn't you say something? That's the benefit of hindsight. The difficulty we've got is a critical foresight. Now, I seriously think history is going to be made next spring when this report comes out. And I think that because there's 56 people under caution already by the Met, and you can tell in the industry that people are getting very twitchy. The reports had to be sent to the people who are probably going to get prosecuted. So people know what he's going to say next spring. I think construction is going to change for the better. It's going to become a lot more critical, and a different kind of architectural thought is going to be required, a better one. One that doesn't just, like I used to do, probably negligently in current thinking, just specify class 0 and think that was enough. That test has got to be worth specifying. I might not have time to go and understand every test. That's not what I'm saying. But somebody has got to make sure that the test that's embedded in the approved document by the government is actually worth following. That's the moment, that's the critical moment, is not to put information into the approved document that every single architect is expected to find out is wrong. That would be stupid. It's to make sure that there's a veracity to the guidance already coming out of government. Because architects don't have enough time to go and see every test. We can't be experts in how you look at a fire door, even how you install a fire door. We're generalists. There's a limit on what we can do. We can marvel at inventions, and this is my favourite one at the minute. This is Ben Wolfe of Honeywell. He's invented the self-testing fire extinguisher, smoke detector. So it's based on an e-cigarette. It means that no longer does somebody with a stick of smoke have to walk around a hospital and test laboriously for hours and days every single smoke detector and remember which room they're in. This thing can just digitally do it by a little puff of smoke inside itself and then give you a digital feedback. He's actually made lots of smoke detector test people redundant. But that's a good thing. That's a piece of genuine innovation. Just like modular should be. Modular for architects should be a genuine innovation, not a fire trap waiting to happen. That's where we need to be. And I think Martin Moore-Bick is going to kick people very badly next spring and encourage that kind of thinking, because that's the truth. It's not the ethical weight of an unknown future. The actual truth is agency and subjectivity and what you do now as a critical person. You're going to be making the future. You're dreaming about it, soon you're going to be making it. You want that future to be good. You don't want it to be a turkey. You don't want 56,000 dead because you've been working in an environment where nobody cared about seismic rules. That's unlikely to happen. That takes decades and a lot of people. But nor do you want to wake up one morning and find out one of your buildings is like Grenfell. You want to have exercised your scrutiny. You want to have got to a point where people hate you on the job because you're asking this awkward question. You become a problem to some, but actually you're looking for a solution. That's it. If that's kind of heartfelt, it's because my entire career has been one sequence of sackings.
Got some questions for you.
When I started off, I could see people's eyes glazing over because I'm just running through schedules. Schedules are boring, but you've got to organise complicated thoughts. So the schedules that Global are developing out of the back of the guide that the insurers have put together, which is an A to Z 300 things. It's just a checklist. It's like an aid memoir. Because there's so much stuff as an architect you need to understand. Not just fire, but across all of the performances, keeping the rain out. So you just need simple methods of having your creative process at different stages in the job activated. So maybe in a year's time, Global will succeed, or in 2 years' time, those things will be readily available tools. A bit like the National Building Specification used to be when it was a paper guidance document. It told you things that you hadn't thought about. That's what's lacking. Because mostly you've got to spend more of your time being creative, not stuck in a spreadsheet.
I wonder, why do you think the RIBA doesn't have the same system that the Institute of Structural Engineers?
No idea. It's not, sorry, man. Sorry, Liam. I don't know. I mean, you have to ask Muyiwa Oki as the new president. I mean, he's from Mace. Mace, you've got a president of the RIBA who it comes from Mace as a construction manager, very used to spreadsheets. Mace are. Maybe he's the president to bring it in. But why hasn't anybody set up a mechanism so that if you've got if you're actually acting to some of these edicts, you've got nowhere to go. I mean, this may have helped the authors therapeutically to write, but practically it won't have any effect unless you can actually report. You can without getting the sack. And you've been working on a job where, for example, a load of fire doors have been put in badly. You could send in that information and it be distilled and turned back into a report. I have no idea why the RIBA doesn't do that. I mean, also the RIBA is longer than it's older than some of these other bodies. Maybe that's one of the things that will happen in the next few years after Martin Moore-Beck.
Clearly there's a problem when things get reduced down to being a set of rules, because that discourages critical thinking. People become reliant on the rules and stop actually thinking about the problem. But that means that you then have to have a general description of the performance or the expected outcome rather than a specific set of rules. And that also provides a sort of framework in which people are encouraged to take advantage and not conform to rules. How do you think you give people the freedom to be critical, but then actually make sure that they are?
Well, yeah, I suppose Grenfell's the massive example, isn't it? That who knew that those tests were not worth were chocolate teapot, weren't reliable, shouldn't be used. That why didn't anybody say stop class 0? Well, actually, that's Barbara Lane Day 68. The government had commissioned a test called Research on the Approved Document and Revision. There was two versions. One was reaction to fire. The first one was fire resistance, and the evidence in the inquiry, which is why this is so significant, and that's why Paul Hyatt has split out the negligence in choosing the wrong insulation compared to the ignorance of the generalist in the architect of going along with a guidance, a rule of thumb that they're encouraged to think was adequate for the external wall and reasonable according to the law. That report wasn't published by the ministry that's writing the approved document. It is now because it's in the inquiry, and it's got everyone's names on it who were there in the room, and some very eminent people who were in the room in 2000, like Debbie Smith, who either she had that epiphany in the inquiry or something else has gone on, and that's now the stuff of criminal prosecution. It's serious. I mean, Grenfell has got the potential to go to a Secretary of State now. And the last time that nearly happened was in the corruption scandals of the 1970s with John Paulson and the concrete tower block boom, where the developer, John Paulson, who was an architect, built up a huge business, was put in prison along with T. Dan Smith, who was the leader of the Newcastle City Council, as his PR man. But Reginald Maudling escaped the Mets, the Metropolitan Policing investigation, because he drank himself to death by 1979 and they never got to him. So is Eric Pickles eating himself to death right now? Probably. But that's not architect. I mean, nobody wants to be there, do they? Anyway. That's probably it. And the question is, where's the wine? I'm sorry if that was a bit dour, but it wasn't meant to be.
Thank you very much, Ian.
My wife hates it. It's been crushing up and out. I mean,
Are they fireproof? That's what
no. I mean, that's the kind of thing I like about residency. You can walk around, there's lots of physical models. It's very old school. You go to some schools and it's all digital. And there's no kind of feel for the thing. But if there's any kind of tangents in any of this that you want to talk about, even the question, say for global, how do you put in a fire bill? Let's go to an installation of a fire bill. There's all sorts of ways you can take any of that stuff and make it much more interesting. Thank you.